I have been called many things in my 60 years: a bachelor of comfortable habits, a man of moderate opinion, a friend to nearly everyone who troubles to know me, but matchmaker has never featured among them. That honor, if honor it was, belongs entirely to Lady Cecilia Dreving, Dowager of Aldecroft, 73 years old and indestructible, who conducted the whole affair with the strategic patience of a general and the gleeful secrecy of a child with a birthday surprise. I had the privilege of watching from a chair by the fire, glass in hand, pretending I knew nothing and knowing everything. I should begin with the Duke. Gideon Aldecroft was 41 that autumn, though he carried it as though he were somewhere outside of time entirely, a man who had stopped counting years the way a closed house stops counting seasons. He had been the most sought bachelor in 2 counties since his wife died 6 years prior, and he had met every attempt at remedy with a courtesy so complete, and so final it left the remedied parties feeling they had been thanked and dismissed simultaneously. I once watched him spend an entire dinner beside Lord Hargrove's eldest daughter, an estimable woman, handsome, perfectly formed in mind and address, and rise from the table at the end of the evening in precisely the same temper in which he had sat down. Unmoved. That was what they called him, the unmoved Duke. He did not discourage it. He ran Aldecroft Hall as though it were a campaign, the estate accounts in exquisite order, the tenants well managed, the house maintained to a standard that reflected his income and refused to reflect his loneliness. He was present at all the dinners and absent from all of them. He drove out in the mornings, he read in the evenings. And in a box in the upper drawer of his writing table, he kept every letter his late wife had ever written him. I know, because he told me so himself at 2 in the morning once, when the wine had been good and the fire had burned low. He did not say it with grief. He said it with a kind of quiet fidelity that I found more affecting than tears. He had loved once, deeply and without reservation, and the thought that such a thing might be recovered seemed simply not to have occurred to him. Enter Lady Cecilia. I should explain that Cecilia was the late Duke's great-aunt, which made her Gideon's great-great-aunt by the branching mathematics of the Aldecroft line, though nobody applied the extra greats, because she would not have permitted it. She was small, sharp-eyed, dressed always in deep violet as though she were in permanent semi-mourning for the entire British aristocracy, and she kept a lady's companion at her elbow during all social engagements, because her ankles were not what they had been, and she preferred not to be unsteadied in public. She had employed 3 companions in the past decade, losing them successively to marriage, which she considered reasonable, family illness, which she considered inconvenient, and one instance of the companion simply announcing she intended to raise chickens in the Cotswolds, which Cecilia considered an insult to all concerned. Her 4th companion was Miss Winifred Holt. I met Winifred at Cecilia's autumn gathering, the one Cecilia held every year in the 3rd week of October, when the grounds of Aldecroft Hall were at their most copper and bronze, and the fires in the long gallery could be kept lit all day without anyone remarking upon it. Winifred came in quietly, a step behind Cecilia, carrying the old woman's shawl and an expression of alert composure that I recognized immediately as the face of someone who has learned to be useful without being invisible and overlooked without being diminished. She was perhaps 25, with the kind of face that does not announce itself immediately, but improves enormously the more one looks at it. A clear brow, dark eyes that moved quickly across a room and settled thoughtfully. She was dressed plainly, as companions are. She had the posture of a woman who has decided that she will not apologize for taking up space, though everything around her suggested she had been frequently asked to. She was not what the room expected. The room expected a companion, a practical piece of furniture, well-maintained but unremarkable, present for logistics and invisible for conversation. What the room got was a woman who listened to everything and volunteered nothing, who held Cecilia's shawl as though it were the least interesting task in the room, and managed it with perfect efficiency, and whose expression when someone said something foolish was so completely neutral that only a very close observer would have noticed it was also, faintly, amused. I was a close observer, I had time. She helped Cecilia to her chair, arranged the shawl, and then stood back with the particular stillness of a person waiting to be needed and entirely comfortable not being noticed. I noticed her. And I noticed, half a minute later, that Gideon had noticed her too, though he gave no indication of it, which is precisely the manner in which Gideon registers things he doesn't wish to register. He looked away, he greeted Cecilia, he shook hands with me. He sat down and the evening progressed. I learned later, much later, when Cecilia finally confessed the whole architecture of it to me over tea, that the gathering had not been an accident of the calendar at all. Cecilia had moved it 2 weeks earlier than usual to catch Gideon before he departed on a scheduled survey of his northern properties. She had also, with a precision that I now find admirable and then found astonishing, arranged the seating in the dining room so that Winifred, who would ordinarily have taken a quiet place at the far end of the table or dined separately altogether, was seated instead at Gideon's right, not at his left, where the woman of highest standing sat, at his right, where the person he would actually speak with sat. "But Cecilia," I said when she told me this, "why the right?" She looked at me over her teacup, as though I had asked why water runs downhill. "Because Gideon always turns right," she said. She was correct. I could have told her so myself. I did not witness the dinner conversation directly. I was placed at the opposite end of the table, flanked by Lord Hargrove and his views on drainage, but I am reliably informed, by Cecilia and by Winifred herself in later years, that what passed between them was not remarkable in any obvious way. Gideon asked Winifred how she had come to know Cecilia. Winifred answered with the facts in plain order without embellishment. He asked what she had done before becoming a companion. She said she had managed her father's correspondence and estate accounts after he fell ill. He had been a solicitor of modest means, and had done so for 3 years until his death, at which point the estate resolved itself into the debts that modest means frequently produce, and she had applied for a position. She said all of this without the slight downward flinch that many women of reduced circumstance deploy in the face of aristocratic attention, as though waiting to be pitied or dismissed. She said it as one states a series of facts that are no one's business to pass judgment on. Gideon said, "You managed the accounts yourself." Winifred said, "There was no one else." He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what method she had used for the ledgers. She described it. He said it was a sounder method than the one his estate manager had been using for the past decade. She said she was glad to hear it, though she doubted the estate manager would share that view. He looked at her directly for the first time since they had sat down. "No," he said. "He would not." Cecilia, watching from the far end of the table, later told me she felt the entire scheme come into focus at that precise moment, like a painting one has seen a dozen times that suddenly resolves into something one cannot look away from. The next piece of machinery required a second encounter. This was accomplished by means of a letter. The letter was, ostensibly, an invitation from Cecilia to Gideon to come for luncheon in November. Not unusual, as Cecilia issued such invitations regularly, and Gideon attended them with the dutiful punctuality of a man who loves his great-great-aunt and also fears her slightly. The letter, however, had been written on the same morning that Cecilia had dispatched Winifred to deliver a separate set of documents to Aldecroft Hall on her behalf, documents pertaining to some charitable endowment Cecilia supported, and which required the Duke's signature as trustee. Winifred arrived at the hall, was shown to the library, and was waiting there with the documents when Gideon entered, expecting no one. He stopped in the doorway. She stood. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. Lady Cecilia should have written ahead." "She did," he said after a moment, "though she mentioned luncheon, not documents." "She may have written 2 letters," Winifred said, with a composure that I have since come to understand is not coolness at all, but simply her natural register. The temperature of a woman who has been managing practical matters without fuss for so long that surprise no longer flusters her. "She may have," he agreed. He came in, took the documents, examined them. She indicated where his signature was required. He signed them. He did not immediately leave. "Do you always deliver things yourself?" he asked. "When Lady Cecilia wishes something delivered correctly," she said, "she sends me." I believe he almost smiled. He did not quite, but I have known Gideon Aldecroft for 30 years, and I know what almost smiling looks like on him. The luncheon in November was, of course, entirely real and entirely managed. Cecilia arranged for the usual guests to be indisposed. She was vague about how she accomplished this, and I did not press, and the result was that only 3 people sat down to table at her townhouse: herself, Gideon, and Winifred. Cecilia spent the soup course complaining about the current state of the Lord Lieutenant's dear management policies, a subject she knew held no interest for either of her companions, thereby forcing them to speak to one another or endure a monologue about servid overpopulation. They spoke to one another. I have been told that they disagreed about nearly everything discussed: the management of charitable endowments, the appropriate role of a trustee in contested decisions, the correct temperature at which to serve game pie, and that neither of them appeared to find this distressing. On the contrary, Gideon, by Cecilia's account, became more animated in 15 minutes than she had seen him in 6 years. He disagreed with Winifred on the trustee question, and she disagreed back, and he said her argument had a flaw in its second step, and she said his argument had a flaw in its premise, and they went at it through the joint and into the pudding while Cecilia ate with the quiet satisfaction of an architect inspecting a building that is going up exactly as planned. "I have never," Cecilia told me, "enjoyed a luncheon so thoroughly in all my life." I did not see Gideon until December, when we dined together at my house. He mentioned Winifred once, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, some question about the arrangement of an endowment, which led him to note that Cecilia's companion had a more logical view of trusteeship than most men he had dealt with professionally. He did not dwell on it. He moved on. But he had introduced her name into a conversation in which she had not been mentioned, and Gideon Aldecroft is not a man who introduces things he is not thinking about. The conversation moved to other things: the drainage problem on the north quarter of his estate, a vote in the Lords he expected to be dull, a horse I was considering selling him. He was his usual self, precise, unhurried, occasionally dry. We were on the second bottle of claret when he said, apparently to the tablecloth, "She corrected Henbury." I waited. "At the November trustees' meeting," he said, "Cecilia sends her occasionally as her proxy. Henbury manages the Aldecroft charitable endowments. He has been doing so for 15 years, had transposed 2 figures in the quarterly accounting. Winifred identified it in the course of the meeting and said so, calmly. She did not make it a performance. Henbury looked rather as though he'd sat on a pin. He moved his glass a quarter-inch. He has not, to my knowledge, transposed anything since." "She keeps good accounts," I said. "She keeps excellent accounts," he said, with an emphasis that from any other man would have been ordinary. From Gideon it was an enthusiasm. I said nothing, a rule I had begun to follow: in matters of Gideon and Winifred, say nothing. He would arrive at things in his own time, or he would not arrive at them at all, and my saying them first would only make him careful. The Christmas assembly at Aldecroft Hall was the third occasion, and here Cecilia's management reached what I can only describe as its Baroque phase. She arranged for Winifred to attend the assembly as part of her household, not unusual for a companion, but the specific instructions Cecilia gave regarding dress was rather more pointed than usual. She pressed upon Winifred a gown of deep green wool that had been altered from one of Cecilia's own earlier wardrobes. "It is far too small for me now, and I refuse to let good fabric idle," Cecilia said, which was true in the letter and entirely calculated in the spirit. The gown was modest and correct. It was also very becoming. I watched Gideon enter the assembly room, make his circuit of greetings, and then stop. Not visibly, he did not halt in the middle of the floor. He simply did not quite arrive at his next greeting as quickly as he had been progressing. His eyes had found Winifred across the room, where she was helping Cecilia settle into a chair by the far wall. He looked for no more than 3 seconds. But 3 seconds for Gideon Aldecroft is a long time. He crossed to them eventually after the room had settled. He asked Cecilia if she required anything. He greeted Winifred with a correct and unremarkable politeness. He stayed precisely 2 minutes and 20 seconds. I counted from across the room because I had by this point begun to understand what I was watching, and then excused himself. But later in the evening, during the dancing, I found him standing near the door rather than making his habitual early departure, watching the floor with an expression I had not seen on his face since before his wife died. Not longing exactly, something quieter, an attention he was not entirely governing. He was watching Winifred navigate a conversation with 2 ladies I did not know, wives of some Shropshire landowners Cecilia had invited. Pleasant women, perfectly agreeable. Winifred was not performing for them. She was simply talking, engaged without effort, her head slightly tilted in the manner she had when she was listening to something that interested her. She said something, and both women laughed. It was not the laughter of courtesy. It was the sudden, genuine kind, unguarded. She had made them feel seen. I watched Gideon watch her do it, and I watched his expression do something very small and very private that I shall not describe further because a man's face, in such a moment, belongs to him. I happened to be standing beside Cecilia at that moment. "He's still here," I said. "Of course he is," she said, and smoothed her violet skirts. I should like to say that I reproached her. I did not. I refilled my glass and watched a proud man slowly, without his own permission, begin to want something. It was Winifred herself who undid the scheme in February. She had begun to wonder. I think the wondering started at Christmas, a small thing, a detail that did not fit. Lady Cecilia, whose household arrangements had always proceeded on the principle that Winifred attended social occasions in whatever capacity was required, but never in a capacity that elevated her above her position, had been making small adjustments. The dinner seating here and there. The particular luncheons that seemed to require her presence. The green gown. Winifred was not an unobservant woman. It was, in fact, her primary professional virtue. She had been managing complicated domestic situations for years, her father's illness, his correspondence, the politely disguised chaos of a dwindling estate, and she had learned to see the shape of things before they were stated. She had assumed at first that Cecilia simply valued her company at certain gatherings. Then she began to notice the pattern. The gatherings all had one thing in common. She thought about the dinner. She thought about the library at Aldecroft Hall. She thought about the November luncheon that had contracted, without explanation, from its original guest list of 8 to a guest list of 3. She thought about the green gown. She thought, with a feeling she did not entirely enjoy, about the way she had noticed herself becoming aware of when the Duke was in a room. She went to Cecilia in February and she asked, directly and without preamble, "Am I being arranged?" I was not present for this conversation. Cecilia recounted it to me some weeks later, and I believe she recounted it accurately, because even the parts in which she behaved somewhat dishonorably she reported with perfect cheerfulness. "Arranged," Cecilia said. "What a peculiar word." "I am not the proper audience for imprecision, my lady," Winifred said. "Have you been engineering encounters between the Duke of Aldecroft and myself?" A pause, Cecilia said. "Then, I have been engineering encounters between the Duke of Aldecroft and the most sensible woman in his acquaintance." Winifred stood very still for a moment. "I am your companion," she said. "I am not a candidate." "You," Cecilia said, "are precisely a candidate. You are the only candidate who has not attempted to manage him, flatter him, perform for him, or require anything of him other than honest engagement. He has spoken more freely in your presence than he has in 6 years. I have watched him. I know what I know." "With respect," Winifred said, and here her voice was very quiet and very even, "this is not yours to arrange." She packed her things that afternoon. Not dramatically, not in the sense of trunks pulled from wardrobes and tearful exits. She packed with the same methodical composure with which she did everything. She wrote a letter to Lady Cecilia thanking her for her employ and wishing her well. She intended to leave by the 6 o'clock coach. I knew none of this at the time. I was at Aldecroft Hall dining with Gideon on what had been scheduled as an ordinary evening. We had eaten. We were at the port. Gideon had been quieter than usual, a thing I had not thought possible, and had twice begun sentences and not finished them, which was for Gideon an extraordinary display of incoherence. Then Cecilia's footman arrived. He came with a note for Gideon, which was itself unusual enough that Gideon read it immediately, there at the table. I watched his face. I have known this man for 30 years. I have dined with him through grief and through obligation, and through the long, polite boredom of the years after his wife died. I watched his expression move through something I can only describe as a man recognizing an emergency he had not admitted existed until this moment. He set the note down. He stood up. "Edmund," he said, "I require the carriage." "You have a carriage," I said. "I require yours," he said. "Mine is being rashad." I handed him my carriage, and he was gone in 3 minutes. He reached Cecilia's house at 6:15. Winifred was in the hall, her bag beside her, her coat on, her face arranged in the careful composure of a woman who has made a necessary decision and intends to see it through without being weakened by anyone's feelings, including her own. The footman had opened the door. She had expected a carriage. She found the Duke of Aldecroft standing on the step in his evening coat with no hat, having apparently left Aldecroft Hall in rather more haste than the situation, from the outside, appeared to warrant. She said, "Your Grace." He said, "You are leaving." "I am," she said. "I suspect you have read Lady Cecilia's note. I want you to understand that I was not a party to her arrangements. I did not seek." "I know," he said. She stopped. He stood in the doorway with the February air behind him and his hands at his sides, and that expression. The one I had seen in the assembly room, the one that was not quite longing and was something quieter and more complete, and he said, "I know you didn't seek it. That is the thing about you that He stopped. He was not ordinarily a man who stopped in the middle of sentences. "You have never sought anything from me." "I am employed by your great aunt," she said carefully. "I am not in a position to seek things from you." "You are not employed by her now," he said. She considered this. He could see her considering it. She was not a woman who hid the workings of her mind behind a pleasant expression, and he did not look away. "I have no quarrel with you," she said finally. "I simply will not be a project." "You are not a project," he said. "You are," and then he stopped again and drew a breath and started differently. "Cecilia has been scheming since October. I am aware of this because I know Cecilia, and because a man with any sense eventually counts the coincidences. I am not angry with her. He paused again. She was not wrong about what she saw. I am simply attempting to tell you that what I am standing on this step for is not her instruction. She did not send me. She wrote me because she thought I would want to know you were going, and she was correct, and the rest of this is mine." Winifred looked at him for a long moment. The footman had quietly disappeared. Cecilia was, I have it on good authority, at the top of the staircase in her wrapper and her best listening posture, but that is a detail for her own account. "I found you disagreeable," Winifred said finally, "at first." "I know," he said again. There was something in his voice that I had not heard in 6 years. Not warmth, exactly. Warmth is too small a word. A return of something. A man who had been holding a great deal of himself very still for a very long time, beginning, carefully, to move. "You were convinced," she said, "that your view on the trusteeship question was correct." "I was wrong," he said. "The second step you told me. You argued with me for 20 minutes before conceding the point." "I concede points slowly," he said. "I always have." A breath of quiet between them, not uncomfortable. The February cold pressed in behind him, and he did not seem to notice it, and she did not step forward to let him in. "And after that," she said, "when did I cease to be disagreeable?" It was not a coy question. She genuinely wanted to know. She had the particular directness of someone who has no patience for the long route when the short one is available. He thought about it, actually thought, which with Gideon meant a pause that in another man might have felt like evasion, but in him meant the opposite. "The luncheon," he said, "in November, when Cecilia went on about the Lord Lieutenant's deer, and you turned to me with a look of such perfect suffering that I very nearly laughed for the first time in," he stopped. "For a long time." She regarded him steadily. "I have no expectations," she said slowly, as though she were being very careful to mean exactly what she said. "I was leaving because I will not be a scheme, not yours, not hers, not anyone's." "You are not a scheme," he said. "You are the only person in my acquaintance who has disagreed with me without wanting something, who has been useful without performing it, and who has— I find I have been aware of your absence more than any other person's presence this fortnight. I recognize that is a strange thing to say." "It is," she agreed. "Nevertheless," he said, "it is true." She looked at him steadily, and whatever composure she had been maintaining, the neat, practiced composure of a woman who does not permit herself the luxury of hoping for things she has not been offered, something in it shifted, not broke, shifted, the way a door shifts on its hinge before it opens. "You are still standing outside," she said. "I am," he said. "It is February." "I am aware." She stepped back from the door. He came in. Cecilia descended from the stairs at a speed that her ankles, in theory, should not have permitted, and proceeded to take credit for everything with the comprehensive satisfaction of a woman who is entirely correct and intends to remain so. She accepted Gideon's expression of modified exasperation with the serenity of someone who has been modified exasperated at for 7 decades and finds it comfortable. She pressed Winifred's hand and said only, "I know what I know," which appeared to exhaust her available vocabulary on the subject, because she then demanded tea and went back to her chair. They were engaged by April. It was a quieter thing than Cecilia would have wished, a walk in the grounds of Aldecroft Hall, a conversation that I was not present for, and that neither of them has fully recounted to me, though the shape of it I can deduce. Gideon asking, with the particular precision of a man who measures words because he means them. Winifred answering, with the particular honesty of a woman who has learned not to pretend to lesser feelings for the convenience of anyone else. I dined at Aldecroft Hall the following week, and the difference was not dramatic. He was not, suddenly, a man transformed into gaiety or volume. He was the same man, grave and measured, with the same iron efficiency in his estate and the same unhurried sentences. He did not laugh more, or speak more, or perform any of the outward signs by which a man in fiction demonstrates that love has changed him. But he turned toward her in the course of the evening, no fewer than 4 times, to share a comment, to include her in a reference to check without speaking that she had what she needed. And once, when she said something that was quietly, devastatingly correct, I saw his mouth move with a satisfaction he did not trouble to suppress. He was pleased with her. Not as a man is pleased with a performance. As a man is pleased when the world contains something excellent and he has the privilege of being near it. 4 times, I counted. For Gideon Aldecroft, 4 times is a declaration. After dinner, when Winifred had gone to sit with Cecilia and Gideon, and I were left alone with our port, he was quiet for a time. Then he said, "She told me when I found her in the hall that she would not be a scheme." "She wouldn't be," I said. "She isn't," he said. "That is the—" He stopped again in that way of his. "She was right about the trusteeship question, Edmund. She was right about several things." "Yes," I said. He looked at the fire. Outside, the April evening was long and pale, the grounds of Aldecroft stretching away into early dark. "I kept thinking about her," he said simply, as though this were a fact of physics, a thing that had happened in the world as things happen, without requiring explanation. "I kept thinking about what she would say." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Or rather, there was everything to say, and he had just said it, in the only shape that Gideon Aldecroft knows how to say such things, exactly, without ornament, as though a truth stated plainly is more likely to survive than one dressed up in language. He looked at me. "Cecilia was insufferable about it," he said. "She was," I agreed. "She was also," he said, correct. The wedding was in June, and I was his witness. Cecilia sat in the front pew in her deepest violet with an expression of such immaculate self-satisfaction that the bishop later confided to me he had found it somewhat distracting. The grounds of Aldecroft Hall were laid out for the wedding breakfast, and the morning was very fine, and Winifred stood beside Gideon in a gown of ivory wool, practical, perfect, suited to her in every particular, with the expression of a woman who has stopped being looked through and has no intention of permitting it again. I have replayed many moments from the months that preceded it. The 3 seconds in the assembly room, the port left unfinished on the dining table, the February step. But the one I return to most often is smaller than any of those. It is the moment at the wedding breakfast when someone said something to Gideon. I no longer recall what, some question about the estate, and his attention was elsewhere, and he said, "Forgive me," politely and without emphasis, and turned to find Winifred. Just that, he turned to find her. After 6 years of not turning toward anything, the most unmoved man I had ever known turned, as naturally as a man turns toward a fire on a cold morning, as though warmth were simply the direction he had always meant to face. Cecilia beside me saw it too. She said nothing. She only pressed her lips together in a smile that was the most dignified and the most delighted I have ever seen on any face, and went to drink her champagne. "I know what I know," she had said. And she had known, as it turned out, everything worth knowing, that the man who could not be moved had already been moving slowly in one direction for months, and that he needed no engineering in the end. He needed only someone who would not be looked through, who would disagree with him without wanting anything, who would pack her bag to leave rather than accept a place she had not been truly offered. And the rest, as any good matchmaker will tell you, the rest took care of itself.